Hello, all, and welcome to AMA 57. It is July 2nd, at least where I'm at, and it is 6 p.m. UTC. It may be a different time where you are. Where I am, it's 2 p.m. Today, we're going to be going through a handful of things. We're going to start off with some discussions of Vola and the Holochain partnership with them, and a recent demo of an application that I got to help do in Germany recently. We're going to then dive into some community questions that have been shared by community members through various channels in advance of this AMA. And then if there's time, we're going to get into some live community questions coming in through whatever channels. I believe that'll be YouTube. I don't know what the other mediums are that people are monitoring for this actually off the top of my head, but real quick set of intros. I'm Matthew Schutte. I am the Director of Business Development at Holochain, and I have with me Arthur Brock, co-founder and CTO, Eric Harris-Brown, co-founder, and Eric, what's your other title aside from co-founder? What do you call yourself these days?
Lately, I'm the pinch hitter. Jump in and solve all the problems that need solving in some place or another. So, chief pinch hitter. That's a
Chief
nice
pinch hitter.
baseball reference. I'm sorry for that if that doesn't land in all parts of the world.
Yeah, he's flexible. And then we also have David Atkinson, our commercial director. I think of David as our director of partnerships because he's always building and maintaining relationships and weaving new things into being. And with that, let's just go ahead and dive in. Anything else? Anybody else want to say anything before we jump into the initial Vola Holochain partnership stuff? Nope. Okay. Recently we did a demo of Vola, or with Vola, of the first application, or the first of a couple of applications that are going to be shipped on a mobile phone, mobile handset that's going to be showing up and available to people this fall. Zippy, can you tell us a little bit about Relay, Vola, P2P
Sure.
shipyard, etc.?
Yeah. So this is really exciting. It's a target we wanted to be able to hit for a long, long time. We did the reverse thing that a lot of people say, mobile first, but we knew that that wasn't going to be easy for us because of a lot of the ways distributed tech works in relation with phone technology and some of the limitations there are. But what we were able to do, and what we're really excited about, is having this relationship with Vola, because they have a phone that they're offering that is a Android based, that is not Google centric, right? So doesn't require the Play Store, it doesn't require any of that stuff. And what they care about is privacy first, and they care about agency and really serving you as a customer, as opposed to having, well, we know what some of the big players want to do. And so it was a really big opportunity for us. And at the same time, there's a small dev shop called Dark Soil Studios that has been doing a lot of work of getting Holochain to be able to run on mobile phones, Android and iOS. And so we were able to leverage some of their work and build a chat app, which is a privacy-first chat app that's kind of similar to Signal, where you can make secure, private, encrypted chats, but it's in a distributed environment, no centralized servers. And so that's pretty exciting. And we were able to deliver the demo of Relay, which is what it's being called, for their community days. And Matt, you had the pleasure of standing up with the phones and actually showing the phone running on a cell phone. And in fact, I can actually take my cell phone and I can bring it up and put it in front of the camera, and it has Relay running on it right now. I know it's funny because it just looks like a regular app. It's a chat app where you have conversations that have been going, running on a phone. Not a real demo, but we're very excited about it because it's a huge milestone for us.
You want to say anything about the P2P shipyard?
Oh yeah, Dark Soil, this dev shop that's been working on this project, they've created a set of tools that make it really easy to take your Holochain application that you developed and deliver it to mobile, Linux, Windows, Mac. and you can follow the instructions on it. I think we'll be able to put the link to the work that they've done. It's just actually really, really awesome. And we've been working with them, and we're kind of their first tester, so getting the kinks out of it. But it's a development environment. It's very well documented, and it just makes it easy to do this. It leverages Towery, which is a development framework, and they've added in the parts that bundle in the Holochain conductor into your Towery app, so it can go wherever. So it's very exciting. It's a really big milestone, a big point for us.
And I would say that in addition to it being an important thing for us, I think it's an important thing for Towery because Towery can now work with distributed backends in mobile environments, which is pretty awesome. One thing that I thought was pretty interesting about how Dark Soil went about not only building this, but they're trying to take a different approach to financing this kind of open source software development. Can either of you, maybe Arthur, Eric, or David, can any of you comment on that? Do you have familiarity with what they're up to there?
Yeah, they've posted an open collective site on opencollective.com, I think is the domain they're using now. And it is a way for, they're basically making their collective work public, making themselves accountable publicly, and setting some thresholds. I don't know how it finally landed. Maybe Eric can do this, but they were like grappling with, do they release it as open source when it crosses a particular threshold? Or I think what they decided is that it's currently visible source in the sense that the source is open. It's not freely licensable yet because they're trying to actually collect some revenue to help pay for building this tool for deploying apps to cell phones and that kind of stuff, deploying Holochain apps to cell phones. And but when they reach certain thresholds, then it will become open. And until then, you can talk about a commercial license, or you can contribute to reaching the threshold. It's sort of like a crowdfunding campaign. And you can go to opencollective.com and search for
P2P shipyard. Yeah.
I think the one thing I would say about it is that it's been a huge challenge. There's a lot of conversation across the industry about how do you do infrastructure development in the open source world. And so I'm really supportive of experiments in that. And they're doing an experiment in how to get that to work and how to make it be the case that open source developers can pay the rent and actually live, instead of having it all be under the need to be supported only by very large corporations. So it's integral to part of the vision change that we're about as well.
That's right. And it's really interesting that you can get kind of game-changing tech out into the world and not be subsidized and not starve, right? Like that's kind of often these things come into the world through somebody kind of slavishly, volunteering all of their time on some project. And so, yeah, it's really interesting that they're trying to pick the gap and find a different way. And they're not trying to become the $1 billion. No. It's like, hey, when these thresholds get met, great. And will they accept more donations? Sure. Will those donations help support the next thing and come into being? Yes. Next step. Well, actually, I'll say a couple more things about Vola itself, because I had the good fortune to go and be the one sharing that in person. And you can find the link online. Maybe the team will go ahead and share that to the presentation. But in addition to Relay, we are working towards sharing other things as well. So we've got this encrypted group chat app, right? Relay, and not just group, but just chat, group chats, one-on-one chats, etc. But in addition, we're working on essentially a backup app. I think of it as like friends and family backup application called Recover, so that if you have your phone and you lose your phone, your device has been making backup copies of the content on the devices of your friends and family, and in an encrypted form, so they're not going to be able to see your photos necessarily. But when you get a new device, you can download all that encrypted content, decrypt it, and ta-da, you're restored. So it's a little bit like Time Machine, except without a company in the middle. Arthur.
Yeah, just normally, I mean, just to point it out, normally we rely on Google or Apple or some centralized, surveillance corporation to hold all of our data and contacts and all that stuff, and then they migrate it for us when we get a new phone. And Vola is basically saying, we're not a surveillance corporation. We don't want to hold all of your information. We want to empower you to set up your own trusted recovery path so you can back this up to these other folks. And so again, it's in the spirit of this decentralization that is in play.
And it's interesting in that, Vola's business model is that they're selling phones. They're not charging you $10 a month or whatever it is that, Apple or Google, et cetera, charge you for doing backups of content, right? It's you and your peers collaborating freely to back up your content. That's a really different vision. And it's one that where your content doesn't end up getting used to train somebody else's AI algorithm, right? To figure out how to better manipulate you, or whatever else they do with AIs these days. Related to all of this, we have another question that somebody had posed, and it was, can we organize some sort of crowdfunding slash reservation to Vola / Holochain phones? Let's say special first edition 4000 Vola with Holochain and HAPS. David, what's your thoughts on that? Oh, you're muted so far. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just going. Yeah, just stepping back for a second, I think one of the broader context for the relationship with Vola is that there's the ambition to be able to have all of your data applications synchronized across various devices and have Holochain power that experience. So I think it's a very deep philosophical and technical alignment that's been built over a couple of years now. And so in the spirit of that as well, yeah, there have been some conversations around opening up opportunities to the Holochain ecosystem and how that all might work. So they'll be announced in due course. Vola recently did a significantly oversubscribed Kickstarter raise for their tablet, which I think was oversubscribed by 100% or something. So yeah, definitely the word has been getting out. And for those of you who do look up Vola, I'm sure the notes will be provided in the chat or provided after the AMA. But
It's on Kickstarter under Vola Tablet.
Yeah, Vola Tablet has been very successful, and the word is starting to get around. They've been really working very hard for a number of years and starting to get a little bit more recognition and critical mass. And the phone, the Quintus, will be the mobile shipping with built-in Holochain applications. So with Relay and Recover later on this year. And yeah, so just to go back there, we're Dr. Versa and I are in some discussions on how this will all work, and there'll be an announcement to the community. If you're very excited and keen, please do also let us know.
Great. Thanks so much, David. The next question I've got actually is, again, going to go back to Zippy and saying the same thread. How does the Relay chat app work? The chat app that we built for Vola, how does it work?
And I just also want to throw in, why is it called Relay if it's peer-to-peer and there's no middlemen? Who's relaying?
Yeah. So I think one of the funny things about the way Holochain works in general is that a lot of what Holochain does is relay, right? That's what gossip is, in a sense. Like, you have your ability to see what's going on the network because other people are there holding the data for you, and you synchronize with that. And so it's like community relay. It's the reason it's called gossip. Gossip is a form of relay. There is also this big question in peer-to-peer spaces when you have chat with one person or two people and you turn your phone off, you type something in, you turn your phone off. How does the message actually get from your phone to another person? Well, you actually have to have some way, some other computer that's on that can receive that message and send it on. So there will be some parts of the Relay app that will allow you to choose your trusted friends and family, or maybe a trusted machine that you leave on at home, that is the relay for messages while your phone is off. And so that's part of the reason why we chose relay, but it's also just a fun name because you can relay information. It just means that word. So how does it work? Well, from a user experience point of view, it's very much like using Signal. You add a contact in, you send an invitation. The person's, we have something that's a little unique where when you send an invitation to somebody to join a chat, you're sending an invitation for that particular person to join a chat. It's kind of as if you're saying, I would like you to join the chat, and this invitation is only good for you. And then they have to send that back to you, and then you've ended up joining the chat. So there's a couple technical things in there that give us encrypted, really protected spaces using the Holochain's membrane-proof technology that some of you may know about to be able to make that work. And we're creating, I think, a really good user experience about what it's like to have that kind of an interaction, which is a little different from some of the other ways of doing it, but it'll be very familiar. People will feel like at home and adding in chats and creating them. And like you said before, it works by, you can create group chats where there are invitations to people to join the group. And if you've got the invite, it's kind of like a speakeasy. You got the code, you can get in. And then you have these private chats where you're invited on a one single person at a time basis. From the Holochain technical perspective, how does it work? Well, we have run the demo, the phone that I actually showed you in the demo we ran was running Holochain as a full node with gossip and everything like that running. So all the node was running, and it was gossiping with all the other phones that were on the network, and you can do that. We can do that in the Vola context because with Vola, we have a lot of control over whether the operating system will shut the phone down and will stop it for memory reasons. We can't necessarily do that in other spaces. And so there will also be a mode which we call zero arc, which is where the phones don't actually store DHT data and other people's data, but instead access that DHT, and they rely on other nodes to be holding the data. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's how it works at a user experience level, and how it works also a little bit on a technical level.
Art, I saw you wanting to make a correction, which I was also jumping into. It was just that Zippy had said, shut the phone down. I think what he meant was shut the app down, stop the app from running in the background and gossiping, which is
Yeah,
something
I
that
think
happens.
I misspoke, because a lot of the phone operating systems, they will close down your app if your app is sitting there. They don't let it run in the background to save battery and to save bandwidth.
Yeah, and with Vola, we can have it not shut off the app in the background.
Or we can have it synchronized. When does it come on to do the sharing so that there's a good user experience? We actually have more control that we can't, because we're in an actual relationship with the manufacturer of the phone and the operating system. It would be harder for us to do that with any phone on any other that's manufactured by any other person who's modified their Go instance of Android, and so that's more difficult.
It's interesting there. I mean, this is not the only context in which this is the case, but the decisions that have been made by router companies, by the makers of Android and iOS, right, really skew against distributed applications, peer-to-peer applications, and in favor of centralized applications. Art, can you say one or two things along those lines, maybe? Whether it's about the mobile context or the router context?
Yeah, I mean, we just have taken for granted so much the centralized nature of apps and servers on the internet and those kinds of services on the internet. Even like when Zippy was saying, a message is relayed through a computer, that's normally a centralized computer. When you take away the centralized computers, if I'm sending you a message, but you're not online at the moment I'm sending it, and I'm going offline, where can that be held for you to find when you come online, right? Like we have to answer those kinds of questions. But yeah, the things that, the way routers are configured and built are not for peer-to-peer, even though with the upgrade to IP Internet Protocol version 6 as opposed to Internet Protocol version 4. There's enough addresses, and we could have routable addresses and all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, mostly we're not very good at having the devices be secure, and it's better if we just sort of use the router as a kind of firewall to prevent things from getting in anyway. So it just, there's always hoops we have to jump through in peer-to-peer technology to be establishing these connections. We're kind of swimming upstream against the current all the time in terms of the way technology is configured to work, and sometimes even the way developers are accustomed to thinking.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I'm gonna pitch this either to you, Zippy, or to you, Art. I'm gonna leave it up to you. What is the significance of Holochain running on a phone or a Vola phone? I'll leave that to you, Art.
It basically, Zippy already answered it. The fact that we have a relationship with the manufacturer actually allows us to tune things so that we can, not be being shut down by the OS trying to conserve battery life all the time, or do complicated waking through the messaging portals of the Android messaging portal or Apple messaging portal to wake the app up again. And it's like we actually can work in partnership with them on it. But he already said that we should.
But there's another level of the significance, which is it actually does work on regular old Android. I mean, I have it running on a Samsung phone and on my Google phone, and so there we have less control. And so the deep significance is that's where most of us are. We want to have our apps on Android, and we can now do that, and on iOS, and we can do the Android side. The iOS side is coming, where there's more hurdles over there because they have even more lockdown requirements. But we've addressed those by having an interpreted version of WASM for the technical people out of there instead of a precompiled version of WASM. And so that's really in the line. And so the big deal is it's going to open up a lot of the market when we end up having apps that can show up on your phone, even if they're not full nodes, even if they're zero arc nodes that need support of another node to hold it. So I'm just super excited about that because I want to run them. I want to run these apps on my phone, and I'm going to make them work because I need to run them.
By the way, nobody put in a question about this because they wouldn't know to, but the things that Zippy just mentioned. So in the P2P shipyard, one of the things was being able to run an interpreted WASM mode, and we did some funding of the WASMer project to have them, because they're the project that we use to compile to native and that kind of stuff, and they also added to their repertoire the ability to run an interpreted mode. And so it's like we're also working in partnership with other open source projects with Tauri and with WASMer and that kind of stuff, and really expanding our capacities for some of these things.
Yeah, that's also significant. Like, what is the significance? That's significant.
Yeah.
Awesome. Next up, with advanced hardware and software for mobile phones, how long do you expect that Holo Host is necessary for mainstream users until HAPS can be used on phones where they can serve as a full node? We've kind of touched on some of this, but Arthur, maybe you can kind of go dive in, because this also opens up a bunch.
Exactly. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a linear answer. It's the way the question is framed is it's sort of saying as if the limitations are on the hardware or software, as opposed to as if it's a choice that an app might make. So app developers have different concerns or considerations. It may be much easier for some apps just to be hosted on Holo. Other apps may want to run in a sort of split mode kind of thing, like with a light client that does all the local stuff, running partial node on the phone, and then like a backend that it synchronizes with that's doing all the gossip, so you don't have to carry any of that bandwidth on the phone, right? That's another strategy that you could do. Another is you run a full Holochain instance, but you turn off gossip, because you say that we talk about the DHT as a circle, and so your coverage that you're holding of the DHT is one little span or arc along that circle, and we call that a zero arc node. You're basically saying I am not responsible for any of the DHT. I'm a leecher, not a seeder, if you want to think of it in the BitTorrent sense, right? And although it's a little bit different because I do publish some info to the DHT, but you can't expect me to be gossiping and up to date to make requests from me. And so that's going to lower the load a bunch, and apps could get away with doing that. And then you're going to have other situations where, because of the nature of an app, which is basically what this question was assuming, that you want to run a full node, you want to run a full gossiping peer. And for some apps that makes sense. For other apps, it may not. Like if you're thinking about, I don't know, a YouTube clone on Holochain, you don't want to be serving video. You will never want to be having phones be where you're serving video. Like, you're gonna break this down into separate apps, and maybe they'll be running a full viewer app, but the media server app will be running on boxes with lots of disk space and big internet connections, big internet pipes, and that part of the beauty of Holochain is you can take your unified YouTube clone app and break it into separate DNAs that actually have different rules of who's running which where, and that's part of how you would tackle this. And so I don't think you start off by just assuming that the goal is to run a full node, but that based on the app and the problem you're trying to solve, you're going to tweak and tune this a little bit differently. And what this really points to is we have a multi-pronged strategy for mobile support. Holo hosting is one of those prongs. So you could have something that's like a sort of HTML5 viewer that might have some of the UI and content locally, but it's actually calling a backend that's a hosted backend, all the way to running a full node. And there's like a few steps along that spectrum. And you could break your app into different parts that treat different steps differently, right? And that's pretty cool.
And I'll just add that in addition to, this was a very mobile oriented slice of the story of Holo Host, right? But I'll add that Holo Host is not only useful for augmenting mobile in certain ways, right? There are lots of folks who are going to want to build Holochain apps, have people participating in those Holochain apps, and nonetheless want to access other folks who aren't yet participating in the Holochain app through a mobile app, a traditional mobile app, or a web browser, right? Serving HTML over HTTP, essentially. And why? Because they want customers that aren't just early geeky tech adopters, right? So to the extent that I was interpreting that question at some level as like, how long is Holo Host needed? Right? And it's like, well, that's one thing that Holo Host is useful for, but there's a bunch of other stuff it's going to be useful for as well. Next question. If you're looking through the lens of a consultant, what kind of institutions or companies would you approach first to present Holochain to them, and how would it be a great benefit for them? Cheers.
Sorry, let me just acknowledge a transition. We're going to the next question that we put all the mobile ones up first. So we're kind of moving beyond mobile now. Sorry, you're muted, Matthew.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, mobile and Holochain, et cetera. Not Holochain on mobile. We've kind of touched those questions. Not that we can't touch more of them if people ask them live. So yeah, diving into this as a consultant, what is Holochain going to be useful for is a little bit like, what would the internet be useful for? Right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that it could be useful for. That said, there's a few areas of focus that I think make sense early on. Organizations interested in supply chain coordination, transparency, integrity, anything like that. Guess what? That's most organizations. Most organizations are interacting with vendors, customers, their vendors, whether they are wanting that supply chain transparency or coordination, or their regulators are asking them to be paying closer attention to where their products are coming from. Holochain ends up being an interesting support in enabling that kind of transparency, in enabling the communication across the members of that community. And I remember a few years ago, I was at a meeting with the innovation team at the World Bank, And I had this realization that, oh, some of those contexts where you're really paying attention to supply chain transparency are not the context that I wake up excited about supply chain transparency. They're places where the world is really pissed off at abuses and problems that are happening. So it was things like mining and blood diamonds and palm oil plantations. And I was like, oh man. And of course, those are the contexts where there's going to be enough appetite amongst certain members of that industry for trying to differentiate themselves from the bad actors. Right. And that was a little bit of a wake up call of like, oh, okay. That's not the place that I'm excited about first and foremost, but I can see how the pain is significant there, because if you're not able to differentiate yourself from the bad actors, then you get painted with the same brush. I'll mention a couple of projects in the Holochain ecosystem that I think have promise. We already talked a fair bit about P2P Shipyard. And for those of you who are excited about Holochain on mobile or just interested, please go support them. If you're a developer, go check out their stuff. If you are just somebody who's like, how can I help? Maybe make a donation. I did. I think what they're doing is amazing. And I've been really excited to see Holochain on mobile for a long time. So I'm excited that it's coming into fruition. One of the other ones is HREA. We've talked about this a number of times in the past, but this is an accounting system called Resources, Events, Agents Accounting that's built on Holochain, Holochain REA accounting. Some of the stuff that enables is the transition from enterprise resource planning to network resource planning. There's a community in New York that's doing bioregional textile supply chain coordination. That's kind of like the first instance of this coming into existence. That's super interesting. But Holochain REA can also be used for things like accounting and financial reporting for complex organizations, right? Joint ventures, multinational corporations that have divisions in different jurisdictions, and they're having to deal with, wait, where was that value created? I mean, we had some front office stuff, but that was contributing to something in this, some of the support for the HR of this manufacturing facility in a different jurisdiction. All that stuff gets really complicated really fast and isn't a great fit for the existing ways in which accounting gets done with double entry bookkeeping. And this agent-centric approach to accounting actually has some real benefits in those contexts. So I'm excited there. I'd be interested in seeing more there. There's also a couple other things, and I'll ask David to add to some of that in just a moment, related to maybe MRV and those kinds of things. But the one last piece I'll mention is there's projects like Neighborhoods and The Weave. You can find out more about those by Googling Neighborhoods Holochain or theweave.social. And those are ways of building different forms of interaction, right? I think of The Weave and its initial implementation of the first frame, Moss, as kind of like Discord. You can create groups and things, but then you can run applications with the other members of your group, and you can bridge between those applications. You can sort of link to them. You can embed, or I call it embroider, content from one application into or onto another. And that enables not just the developers, but the users to be remixing all the content. Now, Zippy's been, alongside some of the other team members, driving that forward, right, with his Lightning Rod Labs company and team. But that's one of the things that I get really excited about. And some of what I see out in the world is not just companies, but communities who go, wow, we would love to use even something like Slack, but Slack gets really expensive for a community very quickly, especially if that community starts to grow, if they want to have access to, 10,000 messages or more or whatever. And this is kind of like that, except not just with chat, but with a whole bunch of other applications and functionality available. And as more Holochain applications become available, many of them will become available in the Weave as well. It's very easy for developers to port them over. Zippy.
I want to just say one quick thing about that. The question was, if you are looking through the lens of a consultant, what institution companies would you approach first? And so what you just talked about here is a general thing about Holochain, is that consultants who are helping companies who are feeling the pain of the cost of SaaS, right now there are a lot of mid-sized companies that are having very high costs because of the ways pricing starts to kick in when you get above the 30 or the 20 number that is the magic number where things are free. It gets really expensive. And because Holochain as a system doesn't rely on any centralized data services, you can actually build applications that don't have that cost. And so if you're a consultant saying to some mid-sized company, hey, how are you going to solve your SaaS problems? Especially if they're a development company and they're looking to create tools for other companies that don't want to incur SaaS pricing, this would be a really good option. They're going to have different business models, probably around the human relationships and other kinds of added value, rather than enclosing the fact that you have numbers and per seat pricing. But that, I think, is an interesting answer to the question from a consultant lens.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. David, do you want to add anything on the MRV or eco-region? No. You're muted, Arthur.
Sorry, I just think we should get through more questions.
Okay, sounds good. Next up, what potential do you envisage for enterprise adoption? I think I touched on a good chunk of this a second ago, but yeah, I think the supply chain stuff is one route
Come on,
in.
but David, you've been doing lots of enterprise adoption stuff. Maybe you got something.
Let's hear you, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, so I'd say that the really, really interesting things right now relate to data provenance. And I think Art has talked about this a bit, where essentially, if you have no provenance on your data, then, well, when you go to query something, in the end, you kind of have nothing. And I think organizations, enterprises are coming at that from a few different perspectives, coming at from an IoT device hardware perspective. They're coming at it from a supply chain, whether it's like validating supply chain activity, where it's not good enough in a way to say, this happened inside my organization because my database said that. You need something a little bit more collective and shared. So in a way, like you kind of need like a micro blockchain or a micro shared space, and then you need all of these. And that fundamentally is something that enterprises are looking for. And then there is a huge understanding from enterprises that the financial system will move on chain. In other words, that there'll be shared spaces where the financial system occurs, and there has to be a data layer, contextual layer to that, an accounting layer to that. And so I'd say though, for the question, depending quite on the orientation, like the best things that are happening right now aren't necessarily people that they've heard of Holochain even too much. It's that there's a particular problem, like as if you're saying, application, an organization wants to scale, but they're sick of SaaS costs, or someone wants to disrupt an industry, but they don't want all of their budget going to cloud hosting, or someone is forced to pay for a product or pollution or whatever in their supply chain, and they need people to be able to verify what happened, and they don't want to build another platform or middle layer, etc. So I think like what the trend is happening is there's enough of the world that's pointing towards what we're doing, that these conversations are naturally flowing. So then the fundamental of the last two is like, what is the outbound that you need to do? But I'd say I'd be flipping the thinking into what's the inbound that's happening? What are the conversations that are happening where someone has worked through and said, well, actually, I can't see a viable alternative, but I know it's non-negotiable that I have to do this particular thing. And they're the core conversations that we're focused on right now, because the consulting and other layers, they're all validations on what has been delivered and crystallized, right? And so we're at the layer below that right now, where we're working with people like with the Vola, where they just know this is what I want to build my business alongside.
Arthur.
Yeah, just to underscore one little thing about that, the low level matters, right? Holochain focuses at the low level on what we call intrinsic data integrity, right? You're recording things in a hash chain, you're publishing to a shared space DHT. There's no way that you can it's immutable. It creates an immutable history. There's no way that once that something has been shared, you can take that back. And you know, that's not what we're used to doing in centralized systems. Again, back to that thing about how much we take the thinking of centralized systems for granted. There are things there are processes that have been created for auditability and that kind of stuff. But many of those, when you have central control of that system, can be hijacked, can be worked around, can be, you're a system administrator, you can literally roll things back. And anyway, it's sort of trusting that people won't do that. But Holochain wow, I did not expect to use the word trustless, but in some ways Holochain makes it so that you don't have to trust any of those any individual system administrator or whatever to be responsible. So given the things that are emerging around carbon credits and energy credits and supply chain and the kind of chains of accountability that are needed, there are lots of products out there saying they're going to offer that to you, but at the low level, that's not actually how they're configured. And it makes a difference at the low level.
That's great. Next question. Does the Holochain organization have plans to partner with or provide support to blockchain companies in order to enhance their energy efficiency and cost effectiveness using Holochain's technology? It seems like a great opportunity to get the word out about Holochain. David, do you want to comment on this? Because you kind of bridge between us and that world quite a bit.
Yeah, I think again, it's similar to what I was saying before. It's a slow build up. There are definitely some specifics we've talked a bit about NOR before. Should be coming out with a pretty interesting tournament in the next couple of months, and evolution of what's happened there, where we've got game data from one direction that also needs to be verified and validated, not unlike a supply chain. And then we've got an on-chain, on a blockchain economic system, and bringing the two together. It's the same pattern that we've been working on with fractal tribute and collaborative creativity. The data layer stuff is very interesting. There's some early talks of doing things like embedding Holochain in blockchain nodes of specific blockchains so that you can actually run a data layer. There's some serious hosting conversations actually, kind of bringing that. There's like, can you use Holo or another distributed edge compute network powered by Holochain to provide compute for blockchain networks? But yeah, I'd say like especially the move in blockchain for the real world asset industry, there's a ton of conversations and opportunity for data layer areas where IPFS is okay, but it just doesn't quite cut it for bringing transparency and insight into the data that will then go into a financial transaction.
Okay, thanks so much, David. Next up, how does Holo compare to Hadera in terms of tech architecture? Art, do you want to take this?
Yeah, so actually one of the things that's interesting for me about Hadera is that they're one of the first projects that I saw actually bring agents into the discourse around consensus. They're still very consensus focused, and Holochain is not, but because they're doing a consensus, and they're doing the consensus by basically gossip about gossip, you have an element that gets created, some data, some state change, some element that gets created. And let's say you've got 250 peers on the network, they have to go to all 250 peers, and then that gets acknowledged that the others have seen it. So you then gossip that everybody agrees to that. And then you basically get this 250 times 250 times 250. You get this exponential function if there's 250 peers, which is 15.6 million things getting stored in the system for the one state change that occurred. Where in Holochain, if you have the DHT sharded, you're just going to have basically the redundancy level, but split to a few different places, like the entry hash and the header hash and the agent activity authority. So you're going to end up with something more like 75 to 150 things stored on the DHT as opposed to 15.6 million things. And that's a very different scalability prospect, both in terms of speed and volume of storage. So that's just a quick kind of comparison, but uh, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just share. I like Hadera. I got to meet Lehman and Mance from Swirlds, the org that kind of birthed Hadera. At that time, it was called Hashgraph. And just a couple weeks ago at Consensus, I got to interview Josh Schroeg, who's working for the HBAR Foundation. And so I think they do interesting stuff, especially in the enterprise world. I think they're an interesting player in the blockchain space, and I'd be happy for us to go play with them more. I think we might at some point. We'll see. All right. Will Holochain interop with current hyperscalers? Art?
So first of all, the question had said holo, and I added /chain to it. And so I don't know for sure whether they're talking about holo, but the thing that I wanted to bring up is that Holochain is our primary scaling strategy, and it is a completely different scaling strategy than centralized hosting hyperscalers. So when we talk about hyperscalers, normally we're talking about like cloud providers where you can go from running 20 virtual servers on a single physical server to this one starts growing really big, getting traffic. Suddenly it takes over 20 physical servers or 200 physical servers. And, you start scaling the virtual server across a lot of hardware, and that's hyperscaling. Holochain, because it's eventually consistent and it's sharding and it's dividing the work out among the network, is just a completely different strategy for it. And that's what Holo as a hosting company is doing for scaling, which is what allows us to have, little boxes that you can just plug into your internet connection, because we're not running one central state across 1,000 boxes. We're running local state across those boxes um, with global visibility into local state changes. And so it it requires some different ways of thinking about how you develop. And so it isn't just like an easy plug and play, like you could take a centralized app and move it over to Holo, because that's not how it works. You actually have to decentralize your architecture of thinking, and learn how to build a graph in a DHT, as opposed to think that you hold all of the data centrally and can just filter it down with each of your queries and that kind of thing. That said, Holo does have some centralized aspects to its architecture for being able to resolve domain names and different stuff like that. And what the decision that we made in terms of hyperscaling was actually to partner with Cloudflare, to use Cloudflare as the vendor for this, and the service workers, their serverless aspects in particular. So even the centralized parts of Cloudflare actually centralized aspects of Holo run on Cloudflare in a couple hundred data centers on thousands of machines. So even those are already hyperscaled. And you could look at the relationship with Cloudflare as a bit of a hyperscaler relationship, because one of the things that I would like to do is explore further partnership with them about Holo and Holochain as edge computing architecture that could even extend some of their CDN and workers and edge compute, or CDN style compute, at least decentralized compute. And especially if we could combine that with like it getting built into the browser, and like partnership with Firefox, and now you start having reasons to have special routing and handling for some of this peer-to-peer stuff because we've really saturated the market. But I'm not exactly clear how we would interoperate with centralized hyperscalers, because there's just different assumptions in play.
Wonderful. Thanks, Art. Next up, has there been any discussions on making sure there are hardening guides? None are on the dev portal, CIS benchmarks, etc. Zippy, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so yeah, we have had some discussions about this whole question about how do you help application developers create secure applications. And there is a little bit of a question because sometimes when people are talking about hardening, they're talking about their applications being vulnerable to exploitation where people get access to people's boxes and that kind of thing. So what I will remind people, maybe the technical people who are listening to this, is that what happens with the Holochain application is that it's already running inside a sandbox, the WASM sandbox. And so that is the way that we ensure that when other people's data is on your machine or when the DNAs that are being installed, they're safe, they can't get at your data. And that's just built into Holochain. And so there isn't anything to say about a hardening guide with that. The place where there's things to say about with hardening guides is how do you make sure that your application does what you intended it to do and isn't subject to people attacking your own application. And there, people need to look really closely at validation rules. What are the validation rules they write for their apps, and how do they use capability tokens for access, and so on. And that's built in. We do need to do a bunch more work on guides and instruction on how to do that well. But I will say, because talking about discussions, one of the things that we have the plans for, and we would like to get to, is something that we call the attack factory. And the attack factory is creating an open source space where you can put your app into, and it will automatically try to do things like have different agents create different types of entries to see if you have written validation rules, and we'll be able to automatically tell you, hey, any agent can write this kind of entry. Do you want it that to happen? And if not, here's what the validation you should add in. And so that is the thing we have talked about building and adding to make it easy for developers to recognize whether they have or have not covered the space of validation for their apps.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Zippy. I've got one more for you. We're going to switch to more stuff on Holo hosting. How many Holo ports are actively running now? If not, yeah. How many are actively running right now? I'll just leave it there.
Okay, and what I understand is that we have over 1,000 registered in the alpha program, and I just looked online, and there's 617 that are reachable at this moment. And so this is people who are have their Holo ports switched on. And that's what we currently have that I saw when I was looking at the data.
Perfect. All right, we're going to switch to some recent questions, the live questions. Some of them are about Vola. Let's see. One, will the phones be available in the US?
I believe that the answer to that is yes. I know that in talking, we heard that they're working on the FCC approvals so that they can actually have it and have them be sold in the US market, which I'm psyched about.
Yeah, I think Vola phones are currently available in 55 countries. I think that's right. And I did meet somebody who is working to get the approvals for the US, Rob. Yay, go Rob. Next up, Vola. A lot of this news is exciting and a great step for Holochain. My understanding is that Vola's market share is very small. How do you envisage this market share growing?
I can say something about that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just kind of logical. When you have something that's new and innovative, a large player is not likely to adopt you. A small player is. You get in there, you prove that you work, and then more people will adopt. This is exactly how we envision getting an increase in market share, by proving ourselves out in a place where there is a high alignment. And I think, David, you could also probably speak to this as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't think there's anything to add. It's a pretty clear strategy, and for the person who asking the question, it's like this is the way that actually these things work, and these patterns are built into Holochain DNAs. These patterns we've been talking about all in our different ways for the last decade and beyond. And I think I think what I actually have not quite clear on the context, but if you look at it, other industries have all been the same. There's something a little bit different in with blockchain tokens in that often they announce a partnership that looks like the balance of this dynamic has been changed. But actually, when you dig underneath it, it is always exactly the same dynamic. A large organization might be working with a particular protocol and they take a first step, and then they take a second step, they take a third step. It is really the world over. Like this is the pattern of adoption, and it's not just technology. So yeah, it's very exciting. And Vola is a great use case, and then Vola will grow. But again, in the question, there's going to be another phone or hardware writer that may be the similar to looks and says, "Hey, this is super interesting." And then there's going to be an app that says, "Hey," and then it's like going back to your cloud point. Someone's going to say, "Oh, this is really interesting because you know what? I've now got a distribution network on this phone, and I've got all of these competitors that have got this SaaS pricing, and I want to go take their market share, and I can undercut SaaS pricing by 85% and offer the same or a better experience." And then they're going to layer in. And so this is just what happens, like, is we lay a significant foundation, relationship fabric, successes, case studies, and it expands slowly but surely. It expands.
Arthur?
I also just want to comment about enterprise innovation often doesn't happen in the enterprise, right? Like it takes a weird, marginal group like Vola to go out on a limb and play with something like Holochain, and then when a new, company decides they're going to do edgy cryptographic mobile, enabled stuff, they may acquire Vola. They may scoop up this, and then that's sort of probably the thing that takes it to the next level, is when a big enterprise scoops up the innovation, which is often how innovation happens in enterprise. So
Yeah. Yeah, I remember Clayton Christensen, right? This is not a radical approach, as both of them shared. Innovator's dilemma, innovator's solution, all about how disruptive innovation works, and it is always this pattern. It's always like this edge thing at the end, off to the side that nobody was paying attention to, none of the big dogs are paying attention to, et cetera. And the thing that I thought was interesting about Vola in particular, they started out with privacy, and we didn't mention this yet, but they also focused on simplicity. Right? They are wanting their users not to be burdened by, being surveilled, but they're also not wanting them to be puppeteered in terms of their attention span. They wanted to make it so that it was really easy to use. And I think when they launched, they thought, oh, we're going to have privacy geeks. And some of the folks that showed up were senior citizens who were like, hey, this is a phone that works for me, like a smartphone that works for me. Yep. And that was like an interesting, oh, there's folks coming out of the woodwork because you're solving a real problem. And so, yeah, I think that, separate from Holochain's growth strategy, I think Vola has a really interesting road ahead, because I think the world there's widely recognized pain that they're starting to address, and nobody else is really moving in that direction in the mobile phone world yet.
Totally agree. And it's also for the kids. I like my kids got hold of a Vola phone, which they now call their phone. But the coolest thing when I found them like huddled around playing is it reminds me of when I was using technology 20 years ago, in that it's an opportunity for creative exploration. Whereas like an iPhone by now is just solely an addiction device, right? Because it's so hyper optimized and you can't actually work your way through it and innovate yourself. Whereas playing with Vola, the other thing I really wanted to just layer in, it's a shame that because it's such a crucial point, is first principle problem solving. So when we're talking about people who are when we're talking about enterprise stuff, and it is a huge deal. So the questions here, I'm not surprised people are onto it. It's a massive deal. Data integrity, data provenance, data in supply chain. We've been saying it, it seems abstract, but when you're trying to sell a product in a European market and you're not allowed to sell that product unless you can verify what has happened in your supply chain, something goes from abstract to concrete very, very quickly. And if you think about it and you start to look at different solutions out there, the key isn't the bells and whistles. The key isn't all of the other pieces. The key is the data integrity. And that's the thing we focused on. That's the thing we've put our resource into. And so and enterprises are discerning to the extent that they'll try 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 different things. But when something goes wrong, like the regulator says, hey, how do you prove you're selling this, you're doing this? How do you prove that? And they can't, because the solutions they've been using don't actually have foundational data integrity. That's a very good adoption driver for the people who've been building things that do.
Wonderful. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap it up. Zippy, Arthur, David, thank you so much. Thank you to the rest of the team who helped put this together, Cami, Jared, Nathan, etc. And thank you to all of you who joined us, asked great questions before and during, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Take care all.